Uh-oh. You're being recorded. Okay. So, so I want to start out with where does CO2 come from and where does it go? So I'm gonna hope that all of you have heard of CO2 before. CO2 is the primary gas that controls the climate of the Earth. Without carbon dioxide in the air, this would be a frozen ball of ice, the planet. The problem is that our emissions of carbon dioxide have pushed the concentration of global CO2 in the air to the highest concentrations we've seen in 800,000 years. And it has happened at a pace that has never happened in not to our knowledge, in millennia. That's the problem. And most of the carbon dioxide that's being released into the air is coming from combustion of fossil fuels. So it's about 35.2 gigatons of CO2 per year being emitted through combustion. There's another 4.5 through land use change and deforestation and agricultural burning practices. So this is all being emitted. And the Earth has to balance its checkbook. Everything that is emitted is going somewhere. And so where is all of that carbon dioxide going? Well, 48% of it is staying in the air. That 48% that's staying in the air is the reason that we have this climate change problem that we're facing now. So the gas traps heat and it's making our planet warmer. It's changing weather conditions, everything we hear about all the time. Today, we're at 423 parts per million. And this is just since 1960, and it has been a steady march and increase. So about half of it is staying in the air. About 29% of the CO2 that's being emitted is not staying in the air. It's being taken up by forests. If the forests were neutral, or were not taking up the carbon dioxide that they are, or if they stop taking up the carbon dioxide that they are, that would have to go somewhere. It would probably go into stay in the atmosphere, making our current problems worse. 26% is going into the ocean. So this is amazing. This is an incredible ecosystem service that we're getting from forests. Now, forests are not taking up carbon dioxide equally across the globe. This is a map of where forests are taking up carbon dioxide and where they're releasing carbon dioxide. If it's red in the map, which you can see in Australia, in Southern Africa, in the northeast of South America and Brazil, it is releasing carbon dioxide. So the land is not doing this service. It's getting cleared and it's being released. Or fire cycles are changing. But much of the globe, especially northern latitudes, are taking up carbon dioxide. Where we are now actually has one of the strongest geographies for where carbon dioxide is being taken up by forests. So this is amazing. This is great. It's key to understand why this is happening so that we can understand if something changes, will it change the sink? So about a decade ago, not quite, I started working with some colleagues at Harvard on this problem of carbon dioxide. And we started looking at carbon dioxide in the city and carbon dioxide outside the city. And cities like Boston have made very, very bold pledges about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If they're gonna actually reach those pledges, we can measure it and see if they're making that progress. And that's what we started doing. So my colleagues and I have like 6 different locations around Boston where we're measuring carbon dioxide and methane in the air. And we're comparing it to places outside the city to see what it looks like before it gets into the city. And this graph is a little complicated, but it's showing carbon dioxide in the air over Boston So these blue and black are what our models estimate, and that move air parcels around in the atmosphere. And what we're observing, actually, like right in Copley Square is one of our sites where we're observing. And the gray line is what the concentration of carbon dioxide looks like before it gets to the city. So it's lower. There's less carbon dioxide outside the city than there is in the city, which makes sense because 70% of those fossil fuel combustion emissions take place in cities globally. So 3% of the land globally is occupied by cities. 70% of all of our combustion of fossil fuels takes place on 3% of the land in cities. So it's in no way surprising that the city where all the combustion is happening has a higher concentration than outside the city. What was surprising, and what's taken up a decade of my life to try to understand, is what happened here. So this is summer. So we're like right here, and it's about to change from having this extra CO2 in the air in the city to it looks the same as outside the city. This did not make sense to me. How could this be? We are dominated by combustion in the city. We don't suddenly stop combustion just because it's May. And there are trees in the city, but there are many fewer trees in the city than there are in rural forests that it's trees as far as the eye can see. So over the last decade, this has been plaguing me to understand how and why this is happening. And so what I'll share with you today is a story of why I think these differences are there. So the first question is, what does the vegetation look like? So this is Harvard Forest. Has anybody ever heard of Harvard Forest? You guys are knowledgeable. It's 100 kilometers west of here. It is forest as far as the eye can see until you see the mountains that are also dominated by trees. This is not a developed area. I mean, there's some roads, but it's really vegetation dominated. It is literally our textbook forest. It is where a lot of the data that is in our textbooks, whether they're my son's 5th grade science class or what we're teaching at BU. The data came from places like this. It's one of the most studied forests in the world. It does not look like where we are now at all. These trees that we have along the Commonwealth Mall or in the Boston Common are different. They're different because they're not trees butting up against trees, competing to get as tall as they can to reach the sunlight. They're trees surrounded by lawn often and buildings, and they can spread their arms maybe and get wider and maybe not as tall because they don't have to. In this area, we also have places that are just outside the city that look like this. There's a lot of forests that looks like this, where you have suburban development and complex shapes and distributions of trees. These trees are growing very differently than the Harvard Forest, where it's all interior closed canopy trees competing with trees. Here, that yard is probably irrigated and fertilized, and likely irrigating and fertilizing those trees next to it. If we zoom into, this is on Commonwealth Mall, you can see that these trees have lots of space between them. They have ample light, which, yes, buildings will shade them, but the impact of building shade is only for part of the day. And it's only it's really strongest in the places in the downtown core where the buildings are the tallest. Most of what we think of as developed urban landscape is actually not that big of a problem. So these are open grown trees with room. These are also trees. This is my yard. There's a lot of vegetation that looks like this. You can tell we like kale and tomatoes. It's also heavily amended with organics that we've added to it. This is very lush, productive tiny soil surrounded by grass that we don't intentionally water, but we do water when we water the kale. There's a lot of spots that are like this that are very biologically productive. The other big giant change that we do in cities is this. Now, if you go back to that 5th grade science class, where you're learning about photosynthesis, and most of the conversation is about photosynthesis, there's actually the opposite reaction, which is respiration. And that's decomposition of organic materials, the decomposition of the leaves, where photosynthesis takes up carbon dioxide, respiration and decomposition releases it back. And so that seesaw pattern that we saw in the atmospheric carbon dioxide is that uptake, release dynamic. In cities, we break that cycle because we bagged our leaves and we exported them. They're still going to decompose. They're still going to break down. They may even come back in the form of compost, but they're not going to decompose in place. So that CO2 is going to be released somewhere else. That's a big complication that I never fathomed a decade ago when we set up this network to say, well, Boston says it wants to reach net carbon neutrality by it was 80% by 2050 back then. We can, if they do that, we can measure it. It's a little more complicated. So what I've come to realize is that this stuff is not the same as what our textbooks say. And there's a lot of it. So across the Northeast United States, which in this case I'm referring to Northeast United States as the Northeast quarter of the country, almost a quarter of all forests are 30 meters. Some scientists, I can't do feet very well, are 30 meters from an edge. So I was watching the Celtics game last night, and that is 30 meters. To run from one end of the court to the other is 30 meters. That is not very far. And a quarter of all the forests that we have in the Northeast part of the United States are just a basketball court away from an edge, which is nothing like what our textbook forests are like. So if you have a textbook cartoon forest that looks like this versus what we have a lot of, especially in cities, there's a difference in the vulnerability to wind. The wind is strong at the edge, and the trees at the edge are more likely to fall down. It's hot and it's dry because the sun is hitting it directly, and it may run out of water. And it may get too hot. And when it gets too hot, leaves close their little pores and they stop doing photosynthesis if they get too hot. There's also a really high risk for fire, because a lot of these edges are roads, which can be sources for ignition. This is less of an issue in pretty wet Massachusetts, but if we go to California, this starts to be a really big issue. These things together are negatives. Are negatives from the perspective of the forest being able to take up carbon dioxide and grow and thrive. And most of the work that is thought about these edge sort of forests and the impacts of development and deforestation has actually been from the Amazon. And what they found is that these edgy forests are more likely to die, more likely to fall down, have less biodiversity, and are really lesser than systems. They're on the verge of collapse. But there's another side to this, which is it's sunny at the edge, especially if you're, depending on what your aspect is and how much exposure you have more light. Now plants love light. They grow towards the light. That's why trees grow tall, is they're trying to get taller than their neighbors and get all the light. Well, you get more light if you have this complicated, weird shape, which is how we distribute our trees. That will stimulate growth. The other side of it is nitrogen, which is if you buy a bag of fertilizer at Home Depot, it is nitrogen phosphorus, and potassium, particularly nitrogen. Now, at edges of forests, you get extra nitrogen that will deposit from the air. And in cities, we have extra nitrogen coming in the rainwater, because we're where 70% of the combustion happens. So that pollution is it's also carrying nitrogen. These will stimulate growth. And so one of the things that we did recently is we broke a paradigm, because the assumption had been that these negative impacts dominate, and that these edgy, fragmented ecosystems are really underperforming, and that everywhere is like the Amazon, which is the one place they had looked. So we looked, and my student, Luca Morielli, he took advantage of the US Forest Service, which does a national inventory of trees across America. And he looked at this funny term that is called basal area, which is just how much of the land is covered by wood, from this national survey of what the trees in the US look like. And we were able to look at 48,000 data plots that people have manually gone and measured in that same northeast quarter of the United States. So we had a lot of data to look at. It is the FIA. And Luca's very clever, and he managed to dig deep into the tables and found out which of the plots were deep inside a forest and which ones were not inside a forest, which most of them are deep inside a forest because that's what this was designed for. And so what's shown here is how much wood is there on the land in a cross-sectional, we call these kind of way, by different species that you have in the different areas in the Northeast. So not all trees, not all forest types. So an oak hickory has a little less than a northern pine hemlock, and aspen birch, which is some of the first plants that come, it has even less, but less mass. But if it was near an edge, it had 14% more wood. Now this is all edges. Some edges are different than other edges. Some edges are next to a river. Some edges are tree lines. Some edges are places where plants can no longer, with the rock outcroppings, plants can't survive. Was able to go one step further and identify the edges that were next to agriculture or cities. A 21% increase in the amount of wood that was there in per unit, like per piece of land. There was more across all the species than what we expected. The story gets better. This is a good news climate story. We don't have very many of those. This whole talk was a good news talk. He looked at how much were the trees getting bigger. So this is referred to as the basal area increments, how fast are they growing? And again, he found that edges grow faster than interiors of forests, 24% faster. Anthropogenic edges next to agriculture and cities grow 36% faster. That means that patch of forest for patch of forest, you're going to get 36% more bang for your buck in a city forest than an outside the city forest. We're still working on understanding exactly why, what's the mechanism that controls that. But those two that I started out with, light and nitrogen, are almost certainly the key ones. And critically, they did not die faster. So the natural mortality and turnover and loss was the same between these forests. So now if we come explicitly into the city, this is a map of Boston that is color-coded by the kind of land cover that's there. So you see some water in black, you see forests in green, we don't have a lot of those. It's actually a deep question. That sounds so easy. It's a deep question. In our case, we're talking about an area that has to be at least 5 or 10 meters in kind of cross section. So at least call it at least half a basketball court. So not a tree, not a tree. So this is where you have forests according to the Mass GIS forest, the maps, where you have developed high density residential, low density residential, other vegetation, which is large golf courses and playgrounds that are dominated by grass. So here's your land cover map of Boston. And another one of my students did some math to figure out of the canopy that we have present across Boston, how far is that canopy from an edge? And the answer is like 96% of it is at an edge, which makes sense, right? If we go back to those pictures that I showed you of the Commonwealth Mall or the Boston Common, that they have a lot of room to grow. They are getting that extra light and nitrogen. So this is the extreme case of the edgy fragmentation. David pointed to a paper that we published a couple of years ago, where this was the take-home figure, where we had measured street trees in Boston and trees at Harvard Forest again, so a Massachusetts rural forest. If we control for what size they are, so how big is their diameter, and what species we're looking at. So we did sugar maple to sugar maple, red maple to red maple, oak to oak. They grow 4 times as fast, street trees, than the textbooks say they should grow. And that is because they've got that light, they have enough water, and they're getting extra nitrogen. So, and this is particularly true for the small trees, because to be a small tree in a forest is to be striving to survive while you wait for somebody to die and fall down and create an opening for you to be able to thrive in the light. This is a tough life. Here, it's a pretty good life. You've been planted, and you probably had a bag put around you to make sure you had enough water, at least these days. And it's if it can survive, if it can establish, it grows really fast. It slows down over as it gets bigger, just like I do, but they're highly productive early on. They die faster too. I didn't include that graph here, but they're dying at a higher rate, which there's a high mortality for tree plantings in the city.
That affect the actual physical structure of the wood? Like if the tree is growing faster, the wood is less dense.
It's less dense.
Does that have repercussions for its stability or
Yeah. It does. It would make it more vulnerable to falling over.
Yeah.
I've never looked at this, but my gut says that its constraints in its rooting depth and rooting environment are a bigger risk for it falling over than a change in the wood density, but I think it is a factor.
Does artificial light in the city have something to do with?
I don't think so.
Skyscrapers and, city lights.
It's a good question, and I've been asked this question before, and I've never actually looked into it deeply. I don't think that is the dominant factor at play. I think the dominant factor is the extra light and the extra nitrogen. Oh yeah, there's one other thing. 70% of the emissions, the combustion of fossil fuels is happening in the city, which is where I started this conversation. Plants actually like extra carbon dioxide. They grow faster. And so the plants, if they have enough water and you give them extra carbon dioxide, they're happy to grow. And oh yeah, there's one other thing plants in the city do really well. They have water lines and sewer lines. And so they get resources. They secrete acids through their fine root tips, and they break those pipes, which my husband is here. He can comment how many times we've had to clean out our pipes because of the trees that we have in front. And it can be a homeowner expense, which some people that don't want those trees. But it's, the trees are getting the resources they need. So if we go back to where I started, I think those are the main reasons why the difference disappears in the city in the summertime. Because we have fewer trees in the city. This is true, unequivocally. And just outside the city, there's fewer trees. We have more development. We have more built infrastructure. We have more impervious surface area. But tree for tree, those trees in the city are behaving differently. They're taking up more carbon dioxide. They're growing faster. And this has big impacts on where do we conserve? Where do we make investments on conservation easements, on purchasing and preserving tracts of forests? Usually, it is not in the city because there's a mentality of this is a junk forest, right? I mean, there's trash here, there's all these bags of dog poop. This is not worth preserving. If we're going to preserve, we should go to the pristine forest that people haven't messed up. And we do need to preserve that forest for a lot of very good reasons, and particularly biodiversity. We need to preserve these forests too. And right now, there hasn't been enough of an emphasis on preserving the forests in the city that are doing extra work for us. So the urban ecosystems move that carbon dioxide through them differently. The conditions are hotter in the city. They're drier in the city because of all the pavement that shuttles water away. And they're much more fragmented. But the trees grow faster and they respire, they decompose less CO2. That together is driving this, I believe. But I have a big caveat of this is what we see across the northeastern United States. The southeastern United States or the western or the southwestern United States will be a different story.
You know, I was wondering about Seattle or places where the conditions are really, you know.
I think Seattle would look more like us than Los Angeles would. Because water is ample in Seattle.
Right.
It is not ample in Los Angeles or Phoenix. So far, if you guys want me to keep going, I'll tell you one more story. So far we've talked about trees taking up carbon dioxide and what this is doing for global climate. I want to talk about one more thing, which wasn't in my title, but David knows I don't follow instructions very well. And I want to talk about what trees do to the local climate. In particular, what they do to local temperatures and excess urban heat. So, trees shade. This is nice. I stand under trees all the time. If I have to stand outside and it's hot, I will get under the tree and be shaded. This is a big service that they perform. The bigger service that they perform, actually by far on local climate, is they evaporate water. So in the process of doing photosynthesis, the little pores on the leaf open and they are taking up carbon dioxide from the air and it's wet in there. And they are evaporating and losing that liquid water. When liquid water goes from liquid to gas in the atmosphere, it consumes heat. It's the phase change of water consuming heat. That actually, not shade, the evaporation of the water is the dominant way that trees cool the city. Great. So if we look at where is the canopy, we're in Boston, we're like, we're here, like here right now. You can see where the canopy in Boston is, right? So Boston Common there, you can see the Esplanade along the Charles, you can see the Commonwealth Mall there.
Why I think that, because you can see Brookline. I always tell people, what's that green thumb sticking into Boston? And that's Brooklyn.
Yeah. And then this is a map measured from the Landsat satellite of the land surface temperature. So this is measured from space at 10:30 in the morning, and it's the temperature if you touch the surface of whatever it is. The surface of the building top, the surface of the tree, the surface of the road. The numbers on this, which I'm going to show you in a minute, are higher. The air temperature in Boston does not reach 130 degrees. The pavement temperature does. Okay, so this is what they call land surface temperature, and these maps correlate ridiculously well, right? Where you don't have trees, it is very hot. But it's more nuanced than that, because you can see the runways at Logan Airport, right? So it's not just binary trees, no trees. There's more to it than that. So one of my other very talented students just published this paper, where we looked at how much does temperature change if we change the land cover. So if we add 1% more trees to an area, how will the temperature change? So this is for a 1% change in trees, we will cool, I'm a scientist, I have to 0.1 degrees Kelvin. It's a lot. Trust me on that. So this is trees cool, grass cools less, buildings heat up the city, pavement, a lot like buildings, heats up the city. And this one here is albedo, which is the surface, it's a measure of the surface reflectivity. So a darker surface, if you're wearing black in the summer, you will be hot because you will absorb all the radiation. If you're wearing white, you will reflect, you will still be hot, but you will reflect the radiation and you will not be as hot. And so this is, you could think of a percent change in the albedo, which goes from 0 to 1, so we divide it by 100 here. It is very powerful in determining how hot it is in different parts of the city.
That's a difference of 1% albedo, has twice the impact.
Yes, it does.
of less than this.
Yes. I don't know if you've seen where I'm going, David, but
I'm a little scared.
so each dot here is a different city. Boston is here. And what's really striking to me is not that trees cool. We already knew that. What's striking to me is how different it is across cities. The trees in Boston and Charlotte and Chicago are very different in how effective they are at cooling the city. And the data set that we used in here was kind of crazy, but one city differentiated irrigated grass from non-irrigated grass. And so in San Jose, if you had non-irrigated, dry, half-dead grass, it acted a lot like pavement. And it actually made the city hotter. In San Jose, if you watered the grass, it made the city cooler. So increasing canopy cover decreases temperature, but not at the same rate. Increasing buildings and pavement increases temperature. Making the city more reflective by increasing the albedo decreases the temperature. And I will do this one super fast. We looked at why are the differences across cities. So this is why is Chicago why is Chicago less effective than Durham and Charlotte? It's because of how much light is incident there, so kind of the latitude more than anything, and then how much moisture. We use the satellite measured product for how much moisture was available. So if you had light and you had moisture, you did more.
Is this just for 1 year? Or is it
This was a 5-year composite. And then for grass, it was just moisture. Light didn't matter. It was just did the grass have water. And in science, to have 2 variables predict anything So with 97% of the differences, that's ridiculous. Like, that doesn't happen often. I don't believe my students if they show me something like that. But it really wasn't simple. It was those two factors. So I have been working with the city of Boston in various capacities since I've been at BU, so for like 15 years. Some of the projects are kind of out there. This one started out as kind of out there. And I was working with the BDPA, the Boston Planning Development Agency, I think. And they kept asking for, well, could we build a tool? Could we do the math for them to figure out how they could make redevelopment projects that were going before the BDPA more climate friendly? To improve what the environmental impacts of the development in that place look like after redevelopment. And so this is Nubian Square. This is one parcel that is before the BDPA to be developed. This is what it looks like now. This is what the designer's rendition of what it looks like in the proposal to the BDPA is. Very different. So we took the map that I just showed you, plus a little more, and built a tool that we've been collaborating with the BDPA on, where we could zoom in to any parcel. That was the one I just showed you, and you could see what that parcel's temperature looks like, and we can change the land cover, the amount of tree cover, the amount of other paved, which is all those parking lots, the building, we have more building under the proposal, and that makes it hotter. And then we could change what color the surface of the building is, and it cools it to a point where if we put a white roof on that building, we can make it cooler than it was before the redevelopment, even though the parcel is dominated by building, and there's the green space is very limited. So we went.
Can I just pause for a minute here? So painting a roof white is more effective than putting greenhouse.
Oh, just stay with me, David. Okay. So we, this was collaborating with some colleagues at the School of Public Health. Every color you see on this Boston map is a census tract. And we calculated how much need each of these different pieces of Boston have for cooling. And so we calculated the hazard of how hot is it, using like that NASA map that I showed you. So what's the difference in the temperature, and where are the hot places and where are the less hot places? What is the exposure? This is all in a report I can give you with nice graphics. What is the exposure? How many people live there? So if it's very hot at the tarmac of Logan Airport, that matters. If it's very hot in a place with a bunch of elderly people living in senior housing at a high density that don't speak English and don't have access to the same cooling resources, that matters more. And so we scored every census tract in the city of Boston for what was their demand for cooling based on the hazard they were experiencing, their exposure to the heat, and their vulnerability. And so there are 10 bars here. These have, the first bars have the least need for cooling. The bars on the right have the most need for cooling. This is the distribution of, in the places that have the least need for cooling and the most need for cooling, how much canopy area is there. So this is not going to surprise anybody when I say that the places that need cooling the most have the least trees. The places that need it the least, because they have it, have more trees. how much land is available in each of those census tracts and those little polygons to plant trees. This is what is being called immediately plantable area. That means you do not have to destroy a building or rip up pavement to plant a tree. But I take every little piece of land, every playground, every golf course, everything that is not built, and plant a tree on it that wasn't already there. You have more room to plant trees in the places that need it the least. You have the least room to plant trees in the places that need it the most. Buildings. You have more buildings in the places that need more cooling. But the buildings are systematically different. The buildings in the places that need the most cooling, more than half of the buildings have black rubber roofs that are triple deckers. You do not have triple deckers in the areas that need less cooling, but you do. You do. You have many fewer than you do in the places that need more. So the houses in those neighborhoods look more like this, which has a shingled, sloped roof. This would be very expensive to do anything about changing the reflectivity of. These roofs are flat, black, rubber, and they're located in the places where there's the least room to plant trees and the highest need for cooling. It is very inexpensive to buy a coating surface, a coating material, and change that black roof to a white roof. So that's what we did with the magic of math. Is this top one is showing what the difference in that land surface temperature is in the places that need the least cooling to the places that need the most cooling. So obviously it's hotter in the places that need more cooling. Okay, so that's the difference that we see in this spread. If I wave, okay, if David waves his magic wand and plants a tree in every inch of space that could be planted, and we wait 30 years for it to become middle age and really have a lot of leaves and cast shadow, we could drop the temperature 0.5 degree. So we can move this point down to there. If I take every single black roof across the city of Boston and I paint it white, I can drop the temperature 2 degrees. This is a big deal because you have neighborhoods that look like this. There is one vacant lot. There is very little room to plant trees, but look at the roofs. Huge differences in the heat exposure could happen with this policy change. Now, before you say, but wait a second, you said you like trees, Lucy. This is why we invited you. I do. We do need trees. The benefits from trees are very low or beyond because they need to establish. They need root systems, they need canopies, they need time. When they mature, their benefits are substantial. They have to survive to maturity, which means they need a sustained investment in maintenance. White roofs have immediate, like the next day, benefits that decline over time because your white roof gets dirty. But even your dirty white roof has a sustained benefit, a large sustained benefit. And I'll say one more thing about trees, which is this story, which was an incredibly impactful one for me from Detroit, about free trees. Many Detroit residents say no thanks. And it's not that they don't like trees. It's that they don't trust the city to take care of it. And in Detroit, I'm going to go to this piece. At the end of the 19th century, until 1950, Detroit was known as the city of trees. It had more per capita trees than any industrialized city in the world. By 1980, more than 500,000 trees had died. Of the 20,000 trees marked as dead or hazardous in 2014, the city has removed 2,000 of them. I do not blame the Detroit residents for not trusting that the city or anybody would come and take care of those trees. So, what are my take homes? Trees are amazing. Like our climate, we have big climate problems, be much worse without trees. 29% of the fossil fuels we emit do not stay in the air warming the climate because of trees. Amazing. City trees are particularly amazing. But not all trees are equal, and our planting and conservation decisions about where we conserve and preserve forests need to reflect the services that those trees are doing and the community needs. Protecting a chunk of forest that has 3 visitors a year can be crucial for biodiversity reasons. Preserving a patch of urban forest that has thousands of visitors is also important. They have different reasons to be conserved, but they're both important. And the conversation has been focused on the remote forests. But we must maintain, protect, and expand our canopy. But we need a portfolio of solutions, and I will be a little bit negative when I say the solutions are too focused on trees. Trees are crucial, but it's not enough. We need to be doing other things, and things like the white roof solution should be done at the same time. It is cheap, it is immediate. Complicated policy to enact. But I've done complicated things, and I have total confidence that the city could figure out how to do it. And these cool surface solutions can yield immediate benefits. And we should be working on those. And that's my whole slide deck.
Well, you can go over, but so 6:56. We do have time for questions, and I don't know if you have time to stay a couple of minutes if the conversation takes that out. Like, if you have a question, ask Lucy if you could repeat the question so that people on Zoom can hear. And if people on Zoom, if you have a question, just put it in the chat and I'll bring it to Lucy's attention.
So you spoke before, and there was a slide about how the water vapor that uses from the leaves on the trees. Does that mean that that's creating more humidity?
Well, it's a dry island in the city because there's less water surface evaporating. Because we have all the storm water, all of our water is shuttled away. So it's actually less moisture in the air on a percentage basis in the city. But yes, evaporating water will increase the humidity. But it's a little bit complicated because there's less water evaporating too, because you don't have any surface water evaporating, it's all going into drains.
I think I might already know your answer based on what you've said so far, but what are your thoughts on green roofs?
Green roofs can do good. They're expensive. And white roofs are cheap. What green roofs do is their main benefit, in my opinion, having looked semi-deeply into this, their main benefit is that they reduce the amount of water that is going into our sewer systems and the probability of us having overflow events of raw sewage into places like the Charles. They are really, really good at slowing down the release of water. And in a place like Boston, that's really important because we have these giant convective summer storms where a ton of water comes at once and overwhelms our sewer systems. So green roofs slow that down. It creates a storage reservoir for that water. And then it slowly evaporates, cooling our city. They don't store carbon. at all. Neither does a white roof, right? But I think a portfolio of answers are needed.
Screen that part on the where it showed the to the bed, where you could summarize again the points where people in the time of year, July, August, September. So what were the kind of points again that kind of spoke to that particular time of year, why that happened there?
Sure. So I don't have all the answers. I'm just giving my thoughts here. Because like I said, this has consumed a decade of my life to understand this, because I didn't expect this. So in the summertime, this is Boston data, Boston's fossil fuel emissions decline because we are not heating our homes. We're still driving our cars, we're still powering our buildings, but we're powering our buildings with electricity that was largely not produced locally. And so those emissions happen somewhere else. In the winter, when we're heating our buildings, a lot of natural gas that is being combusted right here and being released. We're combusting natural gas methane, turning it into CO2 and releasing it into the air. So in the winter time, even though we drive both seasons, in the winter time, we emit more because of winter heating. So emissions go down a little bit in the summer. That's part of the answer. We have trees in both locations, right? So there are trees outside the city, which is what this gray is. There are trees inside the city. I expected there to be extra CO2 in the cities, even though the emissions were lower. I still expected extra CO2 in the city because there are so many fewer trees in the city than there are outside the city. But those fewer trees are doing a lot more for each tree. So you have less, but each one is doing more. And there's lawn. And I talked about lawns. There's a lot of lawns. Lawns are also part of the story. And they are taking the carbon dioxide. So you have more being taken up than the textbooks say that we should. And so the difference disappears.
I see that pollution as well, CO2 is higher than the.
Yes. Depends which compound you're talking about. Some compounds they're very low in the winter and high in the summer, and other compounds it goes the other way. If you're talking about particulate matter, which is associated with combustion, that'll be higher in the winter. But if you're talking about ozone, which causes asthma and respiratory problems, that'll be higher in the summer. But in part because of the trees, because they contribute to the chemistry that produces the ozone. So it's a little complicated. Now, my favorite fifth grader.
So, why are particles pop up?
Oh.
And just go down?
Brilliant question. So this is an excursion that we observed in the black and modeled in the blue. This was a weather anomaly. This was a very, very low atmospheric boundary layer or a frontal system. This was weather. And that weather of
So that's a volcano, but a little bit like.
no.
Okay.
Color sometimes, so you have more space for gases to get mixed up. If you have a bigger box and you put 400 particles in there, parts per million, the concentration will be lower than if you put 400 parts into a little box. And sometimes the weather systems bring the boundary layer of the atmosphere down, and the concentrations can get crazy high for a little bit. So this is weather, weird weather. That's good. Uh-huh. So we've seen it in other years. This is showing just a snippet of it. This happens every year, but a drought would unequivocally affect it. And Well, it depends on what kind of drought, and is the drought equally severe in the city as it is outside the city? Right, because the droughts usually are more regional in scale. And in the city, we have hoses. And we have pipes and we have that infrastructure. So the trees actually have more opportunities to get water than a forest that only has rainwater or groundwater to access. So under very water constrained situations, like a drought, the city trees will probably do better,
Even if they're getting hotter.
even if they're getting hotter. I could have shown a figure that I didn't, that under the hot weather, the city trees don't shut down like their country cousins. They keep going. They've acclimated to the heat. Yes.
Okay, so that's like this winter.
Because it was so warm. Mhm.
Yeah. Grass, you want winter?
Yes, yes. Yes. Because the extra emissions in the city would be smaller than normal. So absolutely. Is he everybody's favorite fifth grader now? They act like roofs with snow. And that's actually a really, I gave a flip answer, but that's a really good question. So the white roof in the summer will be cooler. It will be cooler to the surface, which is what this is measuring with the satellite. It's actually also cooler inside the building. Yeah, duh. It's cooler inside the building, which means you're going to be running your air conditioning less, and you're going to be emitting fewer greenhouse gases to control the temperature inside the building. Now in the winter, that is not true, because you're going to be reflecting the sunlight that we're getting in the winter, making the house a little bit cooler than it would have been if it had a black, highly absorptive roof. But it comes out as the summer dominates in this effect versus it dominates in multiple ways. You could do this calculation because you have fewer hours of sunlight in the winter, and a portion of the winter in a place like Boston, the roof is white anyway. So it's actually a quite good question.
So if you were to run an urban forestry nonprofit, what would you take away from this that would sort of inform your work?
Is that if you've got a captive audience that cares, so I have devoted my career to studying trees. I am not anti-tree, right? And there's a ton of benefits that forests and tree planting give that I did not quantify or even mention in this talk. But if you've got a captive audience that is willing to show up on Saturdays to dig and plant trees, they're probably also willing to do other things to improve their local environment. So I think that coupling initiatives like tree planting and conservation and easements, coupling those initiatives with outreach for other things that could be done in that community, particularly if you're in one of those really hot communities, if you reach the people, you can have double the impact by doing multiple things. So I've presented this to the BDPA, and I think 6 different units in the city of Boston. It's got some nice NPR coverage when we did this Boston analysis, and there are definitely people talking about it. Oliver Sellers Garcia now refers to me as the white roof lady. He can't remember my name, but he remembers the story I told, which is maybe more, he's the new Green Deal something for Boston. So Boston is talking about this, and what I will say is when we shared these findings with Boston, we actually pointed to Louisville, Kentucky, which implemented, they got shamed, Louisville, as being particularly hot and having particular heat disparities. And they did something about it. They got some really terrible media coverage and they responded with policies to tackle it. And they responded with a white roof policy that I think is just brilliant, which is they work with contractors, lots of contractors, any contractors, as opposed to individual homeowners per se, because the contractors reach many homes and offer a subsidy at the time that they were already going to change their roof to change it to a white roof. And they've had huge uptake and big changes in what the surface color of Louisville looks like. It's an early project, it's only been a few years, but people are taking them up on the offer of free, not free money, of reduced roof replacements that they were going to do anyway, but they'll do a different roof because you'll make it cheaper and get a climate benefit.
They're also doing a big tree study into it. I don't know about that. Affecting a ton of trees and looking at heart disease rates over time. So Louisville study is like 100,000.
Louisville, sometimes a little bit of shame could bring about some incredible improvement.
Speaking of shame, there is a effort at the city to develop a tree ordinance.
Yes, I read about it in the paper.
Yeah, and this is, I think, a great example on, you know, those big trees really matter.
The big trees really
And
matter.
I know you've been hammering that point for decades or 50 years.
The big trees really matter. The planting the small trees is really important. It's even more important to keep the big trees alive. All right, I think my fifth grader may need dinner. So how about, I saw two and then we'll call it.
What is the,
It's a coating. And the early ones were apparently flaky because they hadn't optimized it. It is now optimized. It wears at the same rates. It does not flake off and contaminate water streams. It's an additive to the, not paint, but coating that's applied when they resurface the rubber roofs. I have no idea. You've gone beyond my know-how. We don't have a flat, we have the other kind of roof. And ours is black, 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 because it's covered in solar panels, but that's a different talk for a different day.
You said the report, I feel like.
So she said that she needs talking points for her building to get them to agree to a white roof. So we wrote in plain English, white paper, that if you Google my name, which is impossible to spell. Oh, look, I have a slide with it. If you Google my last name and Boston University Initiative on Cities White Roofs, you'll find this report that is nicely formatted by somebody who wasn't a scientist and written in plain English that describes that simulation that we did about planting every inch of the city versus painting it all white. And you could have all the details that I glossed over today. And there's an NPR story that Barbara Moran wrote and ran on there's a print piece and a radio piece where she did she's amazing, the NPR environment reporter. So much more understandable than I could ever write it. She's very talented. She wrote a nice story about it that got a good amount of traction. This is all new, like this, we have been working on outreach on this just the last couple of months. We've just finished this analysis. So before I agreed to give this talk.
Well, thank you. Round of applause for Mr. If I ever want to start another nonprofit, I'll focus on building white